Hello and welcome to Why Postliberalism Failed. This is episode 16, although we did record episode 15. We are hanging on to it and might release it later. But this is episode 16, and today is October 11th, 2024. We are one hurricane more than we used to be. The reason why we delayed the release of last week's episode was because after we recorded it, I immediately went into hurricane prep mode, and all of the post production we normally do with this podcast got put on hold. And so the process of uploading this, I think, would have been on the same day that I was mad dash recordings of lectures to students. I had actually recorded all day the day before, but I had the wrong input. So I was trying to record off of a mic that was off. Real nightmare scenario, but let's not talk about my problems anymore. Let's instead introduce my eternal co-host, Thomas Howes.
How's it going, James? Glad you survived the hurricane.
I'm sorry, I meant to say your my eternal co-host, Tomas Hose. Is that how you say your name?
No, you had it right
No.
the first time.
Oh,
Yeah,
so
it's okay.
today's gonna be a little less formal, because what we're gonna do instead is I guess what the kids call clap back. We're gonna do some clapbacks.
Yeah, let's clap back.
But the problem, so there is a much bigger podcast than this one called The Remnant. It's hosted by Jonah Goldberg.
Yeah, we're
Uh,
both big fans of Jonah Goldberg.
yeah, yeah, Jonah does a great podcast. This is how, of course, I heard about it, is that I just listened to The Remnant. And he had on one of the most influential American lay Catholics, in alive today as a guest. It was George Weigel,
Yep,
and
George
George Weigel.
Weigel.
What's that?
George Weigel. He's famous for writing the biography of John Paul II.
And friends of many popes, and they were going to talk about contemporary Catholicism. In a way that interested me, given our subject matter. Excuse me as I look down here. It's called Pope Fiction. It came out on October 2nd, so 9 days ago as of our writing. And so there was a lot of interesting stuff in there, but we want to zero in on the subject of integralism and post-liberalism as he described it. But before we do that, maybe we should talk a little bit about George Weigel. And, Tom, if you want to start, I'm going to go grab something so I can do my bit.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, let's see, George Weigel. George Weigel was really kind of a big deal among conservative Catholics during the 1980s and 1990s, and also the 2000s, right? Because he was well connected with people in the sort of the conservatism of Ronald Reagan and the two Bushes, and he was influential in bringing a lot of Catholics, or being a spokesperson for Catholics uh, who saw quite a bit of value in the fusionism of those of Ronald Reagan, and also the sort of foreign policy of the Bushes, right? So in recent years, the other big one was Michael Novak, who was
Mm-hmm.
Michael Novak. Those two, it's interesting because they're always talked about together. They always talk about it as like the neoconservative Catholicism of Michael Novak and George Weigel, but very different personalities, right?
Yeah, definitely.
um, uh,
Michael Novak was at the end of his life a professor here at
mhm,
Ave Maria University. Although I never got to meet him, when I came here, he was actually taking a year in Catholic. He had gone up to CUA.
yeah,
I think partly for medical reasons. I think it was easier for him.
yeah.
And then he didn't really have a public presence after that, and then he passed on. But anyway.
Yeah. He was involved in, I think, the Institute for Human Ecology,
Mm-hmm. That's
right?
right.
And I was a grad student at CUA, and I was, after he passed away, I was kind of sad I didn't have a chance to meet him because he was always somebody who I looked up to. He is like me. He was previously a seminarian in Rome, so we had that like similarity, and then he ended up leaving seminary, becoming married. Um, and so I always thought of him as sort of a model person for somebody in that situation. He had wrote a book when he was younger called "The Tiber Was Silver," right? I think that's the name of the book. It's a
I don't know.
novel.
I had not
It's
heard
a
of that one.
Yeah, it was the first thing that it got him into grad school at Harvard. I think
Oh
was
wow.
he published this novel about a seminarian in Rome that's partly based on his own experience. And it's called The Tiber Was Silver. And when I was in Rome and I had a copy of that book that was from my grandma had owned it. Um, I just looked over the Tiber and it looked pretty green to me.
Mm.
It didn't look silver. But I found out like everybody who lives in Rome finds out once you leave, you miss it so much and you forget that it's green and you start to remember it as silver. So it made sense to me. And then actually, last time I went there, they actually had cleaned it up quite a bit. It didn't look green anymore, so that's good. But sorry, that's just a personal biographical note about. Anyways, Michael Novak, George Weigel, they were a big deal at that time. But as George W. Bush became less popular because of the Iraq War and the War on Terror and all of that, the conservative Catholic sort of subculture became more critical of sort of the neoconservative view of Weigel and Novak, right? They say neoconservative, but I mean Novak was closer to a Reaganite than anything else. But anyways, but
Yeah, neoconservative was a later appellation. I'm not old enough to have witnessed like the peak form of Weigel, Newhouse, and Novak.
yeah,
Newhouse being Father oh my gosh, what's his name? Um Richard John Newhouse. I don't know, it just happened to me. But that he was sort of the third of the triumvirate.
yeah,
No one called them neoconservative
no,
back during the
no,
Reagan days. They were only called neoconservative to kind of create
disparage them.
yeah, to disparage them,
Yeah,
and it would kind of establish this like artificial equation of George Weigel to Dick Cheney to Don
yeah,
Rumsfeld,
that's right.
and no, no,
Yeah,
but this is sort of how you do this is if you can successfully label your opponents, as in this case the left did,
yeah,
then you can define them. So that's what makes Thomas and me right libs, even though
yeah,
we
that's right.
differ pretty substantially on some questions about
Yeah,
liberalism.
so you and I have a lot in common with Novak and Weigel. Like, really, in my opinion, they were more fusionist conservatives than anything
Yeah,
else. Maybe they had some egg on their face because the Iraq War didn't go so well and they were supporting Bush at the time. But I
which is
mean,
always the problem.
yeah, that's going to happen to anybody. You support some candidate and then they do something that's imprudent, right?
So yeah, it always goes like this: you accrue a certain amount of intellectual and elite capital or prestige,
Yeah,
and it's of no use to you if you do not use it to the ends that you wish to pursue. And so you dedicate it to a particular political figure or movement. And now all of that is a wager on the success of that
yeah,
moment. And unfortunately for them, the Iraq War was a terrible choice
yeah,
for that wager, and so they won the neoconservative label and nothing else.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean Novak, every account I've ever heard of him, the guy was like a saint. He was just such a good guy. Everyone liked him.
Mm-hmm.
He was very charitable to his opponents, even though his opponents were never charitable to him.
Yeah,
It's just it was but anyone who knew him knew he was a good guy. And Weigel also, although a little more gruff and
yeah.
than Novak, is also probably a good guy. Um, but so normally you and I are defending Weigel, but here we're gonna push back on him a little bit because we think one of his blind spots today is that how old is Weigel?
Oh, that's a good question.
Probably
Um,
70 something at this point.
yeah,
So Weigel, he's a boomer, right?
73.
73. So Weigel, if you're listening, we are always defending you, but we're gonna push back on this one thing. We don't think Weigel has much contact with Catholics under the age of 40.
No, I don't think
Yeah,
he does.
and I think that
And
that
those
leads
that he
to
does are probably hand selected for him by staff and other people that are looking for people who are interested in meeting Weigel.
yeah,
And so he gets a lot of artificial positive feedback.
yeah. That's right. That's right. So, what was the claim then? I actually have to run real quick here. But
Yeah.
James, tell the
I'll,
audience what the claim was that we want to respond to.
so the trouble that we ran into with Weigel's argument was that he offered a position on integralism that struck me as a little detached from the world. The reason why is, as we mentioned before, is it might be because he's not really meeting with young people. But the position was that integralism, post-liberalism are primarily online phenomena. And if I'm looking down at my phone, it's just because I have the transcript on my phone and a full screen for the podcast. But yeah, so this idea of it being a primarily online phenomenon is a very outdated view. This outdated view is the result of um, I think not keeping up with major changes. I'm not going to find the transcript line that I'm looking for since when it first emerged. This is not the first time that I've actually squared off with Weigel on this question. I wrote for Law and Liberty a few years ago a article reviewing the work and legacy of Father John Courtney Murray, and in it I talked about the problem of post-liberal and integralist positions, and he offered the same line to me then, that this is a primarily online phenomenon and is of no importance. Now there are a few things wrong with this approach. The first is that what's up, Thomas?
I'm here. What's up?
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. He's back.
I just had to
S-
throw away a paper coffee cup, so you're good.
well, I'm glad that we got that dealt with.
Oh, and I have a little bit of a cold, and I also had to,
Oh, he had to go hack up a lung in the hallway.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's fine. So the first problem with this position is that it's outdated. It was a primarily online phenomenon in like 2015, where there were a few Facebook threads, infamous Facebook threads. In my case, I knew of this one that was called the Never Ending thread, by a friend of mine named Matt Peterson. It's now at the Blaze, and so integralism got in there somehow. And of course, the establishment of the Josias. There's the Santa Crucis blog that Potter Edmund Waldstein created. And all of this sort of like period where it was a primarily online phenomenon emerges at its height with the publication of Before Church and State, which is Andrew Willard Jones's book on Louis the Ninth, and this becomes the sort of first point of integralism that people can latch onto. And during this period, integralism was also much more interesting than it is now, because the people who claimed to be integralists were all over the place. So you had Kevin Gallagher, who and Matt Cairn, and various also sort of pseudonymous. Originally, Matt Cairn was woke space Jesuit on Twitter. Still one of the funniest people I've ever seen on the medium. Was by himself worth the entire medium for a while there. There's one particular one that he did about living in it's like Tudor England during the English Reformation. Anyway, I don't want to go on that. There were like these sort of failed attempts to get a movement going on what was called left integralism, with things like Fair Forward, and um, these efforts actually kind of fall apart when raging to the front of this movement were Gladden Papin and Adrian Vermeule, two Harvard. One's a Harvard professor, the other one's a Harvard product, actually a Harvey Mansfield student, which it blows my mind. But Papin is they really pivoted towards a fascist direction, and this caused a rift with this, sort of crazy, primarily younger Orthodox Catholics thinking about the social question. and essentially kicked them all out. And so integralism became essentially clerico-fascist, and therefore truer to form in its historical variety. And what's weird is, as a result of that, like I got to be sort of better friends with these guys. My very first article I ever wrote on integralism was actually arguing against Kevin Gallagher, and Kevin Gallagher's piece was in, if you can believe it, American Affairs,
Hmm.
which is
Happens.
Julius Krein and Gladden Papin's journals. So this tells you sort of like the rate of change in this online context. But as you can see, by then, when I'm arguing with Gallagher on Law and Liberty, he's written for a journal. All right. So
Hmm.
it's online, but it's not online, right? It's not like Twitter memes and anonymous accounts and trolling. It's an incredibly well-funded sort of reactionary journal
Yeah.
like American Affairs, and in a very well-funded fusionist journal like Law and Liberty. This has reached this point, and even then there were people saying that this is niche. And I'm sorry, if you have a Harvard law professor of constitutional law uh you know intentionally attempting to influence the way conservative jurisprudence operates, it's no longer a marginal online affair. By
Yeah.
definition, you're already dealing with something that's more serious than that, and you were seeing evidence of this all over the place.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking to somebody who was at Boston College a couple years, like, gosh, that must have been 5 years ago now, like 2019. And he said all of the Catholics there at Harvard were integralists.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
a lot of them, like all of them were integralists. And a lot of these students of Vermeule are probably, I haven't looked up the numbers, but Vermeule's a significant figure in jurisprudence for administrative law. And you see him cited frequently by people like, even on the left, but normally by the left, actually, because they prefer his views on bureaucracy, like Elena Kagan. And Elena Kagan's no radical, of course, but she's got a normal left wing views on bureaucracy. Um, and you have to imagine Vermeule's, I mean, you have to imagine Vermeule's students are getting clerkships, right, with Supreme Court justices. And
yeah. There's some people who know more about this than me. I would name check them, but I would have to clear it with them first, that
yeah.
know this for a fact. And this person explains how, like, a lot of the people that Vermeil places at federal benches, the judges need to essentially deprogram them to explain to them that this like crazy ideological position about seizing power and using it for the common good is more complicated than just writing this out. It's actually often making difficult choices in questions where there's criteria for evidence and all these things you would think they would have learned in law school, but instead they learned Carl Schmitt and very very obscure tertiary influences on the Constitution that preoccupy Vermeule's day. And I'm not saying that Vermeule wouldn't be influential if he wasn't the son of two Harvard professors. I'm just saying he probably wouldn't be at Harvard, and they certainly wouldn't publish things like Common Good Constitutionalism, which is a terrible book of a very low quality scholarship. And I am saying anything new, as I said this in a book review titled Uncommonly Bad Constitutionalism. But the fact that he derives the influence of common law and ties it to this like the northern Italian constitutional tradition, the name of which has escaped me. Do you remember what it is?
Or
Um,
are you talking about
it's this nutty raison. It's not raison
oh,
d'état.
you're talking about the reason of state tradition.
Yeah,
Yeah,
uh,
that's actually, well, isn't what is it? Yeah, Rajon de Stat, that would be Italian, that wouldn't it? But that was popular in the 1500s.
yeah, and he has no historical or textual evidence that any of it was ever used. Although, like in one citation, he refers to the Constitution of Alaska, which is probably my favorite part of the book. That
Hmm.
I imagine the founding fathers of Alaska sitting down and blowing the dust off of treatises from Milan It's like, at
Well,
last. So, this,
well,
so
I think there's also an article by Gladden Papin about that, because the this Rajon de Stad
yes.
thing, the and I think he claims that it was like sort of influential in the French court under the absolutist French kings. And that was interesting. I don't know much about it, honestly. I know about as much as I've read from Vermeulen and Papin. But I mean, I'm a big supporter of modern constitutional democracy, so I saw that as a correction to all that absolutist nonsense before that.
Yeah, so I was using the French term, but it's the same thing, which is Rajan de Stato.
Oh yeah,
So that so it turned the reason why my brain was malfunctioning there was I was actually using the right term in the wrong language.
Oh, just going back and forth. Oh, okay,
Yeah,
okay.
so I'm sorry to go on a little tear there. I just whenever I always get very annoyed at the fact that that um people will take Adrian's expertise in administrative law and they'll apply it outside of that expertise and claim expertise on other things where he seems not to know what he's talking about. And
Yeah.
one of these would be Catholic political thought.
Well, that's one of the issues, and I mean, sort of the incentive structure of academia, right? You have people with these positions that have a lot of wield a lot of power as in their they can do a lot for their students or the people that work with them. Co-writing some. We found out that some of these scandals with professors, uh, you know, basically doing pay for play, where they write articles with people to help them, lift them up in their profession. But normally it's like it's like a quid pro quo situation, or it's just somebody who that's just how they exercise their building their legacy. So they have all these people in power that were their disciples. Um,
All right, so we had to take a quick break there, but so we were
Part
talking.
two.
What's that? Yeah,
Part two.
part two. So the second thing that Weigel really seems to miss here is that just because something is online does not mean it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
For someone like Weigel who's in his 70s, the internet is something that came on to him late and was not a formative experience for him.
Yeah.
He grew up in a broadcast and print media context, and online is weird and not really something he seems to be that comfortable with, as demonstrated by the fact that he has very little online footprint.
Yeah.
Um, Now, because he takes this position, it's actually been very bad for his position. And a lot of people I know who take the same positions as we do have been very insistent that the problem is that we're too online, and if we met people outside in the regular Catholic world, we wouldn't see people as like this as often, which is sort of true in an irrelevant way. What matters is that the aim for post liberals and integralists, and this is something they very clearly state, is to influence leadership of the institutions,
That's right.
not to establish a broader constituency for their ideas. That comes later when you've captured the leadership.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And
So,
that's what they're doing. I mean, that's why they punch way above their weight as far as like as a portion of the population, they're like nothing, right?
yeah,
But
so when we talk about post-liberalism and integralism, it's important to note that what started off as an ideologically diverse group of young people in 2015 is now a candidate for vice president on the GOP ticket.
yeah, that's
How
right.
long did that take? 10 years?
Yeah, around 9 years. Yeah.
And that's not primarily online.
Yeah,
Uh,
no,
but
that's
if
right.
but if you attend to Vance's ideas, there'll be ideas you've heard online.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just the fact that they're online is not something to dismiss. It's actually something to take seriously.
Yeah. I mean, it's part like Vance is split between this sort of post-liberal influence and this other tech authoritarian influence of what's his name? Yarvin, right?
Yeah.
Curtis Yarvin. That that's got billionaire backing to it.
And
Yeah.
it's primarily online, but once again, that's actually makes it more serious
Yeah.
that it has that much money behind it.
Yeah.
And post-liberalism and integralism has a fair amount of prestige behind it. Also, it's funded by the Hungarian government through Papin,
Yeah, that's right.
indirectly.
It was the
So
organization that Papin's the head of in Hungary.
it's like the Hungarian International Institute for International Affairs, HIIA.
And we know, like, because we're in these circles, because we're Catholics and we're, conservative. I mean, uh, the organizations that support ideas like us, these more like class, I don't know, fusionist conservative ideas, they're few and they're less funded. And
Yeah.
the organizations that are getting funded from Hungary, they're doing great for funding. And
To the point
that's
where you wonder where the money's coming from because Hungary has no money, right? They're
yeah,
losing people, they have no tax base.
yeah.
And so it's reasonable to assume that there are bad actors that are funneling money through Hungary, one way or another. I don't mean to go like full Alex Jones. They're putting chemicals in the
Oh,
water that make the frickin' frogs integralist.
well, if you notice,
Um,
none of well, yeah, they are. No, I was kidding. But
the Chem
they,
Trayers they're full of
yeah.
Leo the 13th encyclicals.
But no, in none of these like Hungary funded organizations will they ever say anything bad about Putin or suggest that maybe it's okay for the U.S. to give a little bit of support to Ukraine. You notice that?
Yeah, yeah, that's right. So it's odd to say, well, this is a primarily online thing, and then use that as a reason to dismiss it.
Yeah,
When it's where do over 60% of the United States gets its news online.
yeah,
And while Twitter is not the most common place people get their news, it's the most common place where people of influence
yeah.
traffic and influence.
That's right.
So
And
when people are saying you need to get off Twitter, they're saying you need to reduce your influence. And I would say that when it comes to people on Twitter, one of the people who has the smallest influence is George Weigel. And
yeah,
he doesn't
that's right.
do what he needs to do to persuade people to his position. What he does instead is he writes in First Things, and Things, to be honest, is at best a hybrid, but primarily mostly a post-liberal institution now.
Well, that's interesting that he writes in First Things and he hasn't noticed this because I don't even click First Things anymore since the whole Mortara article because I was so upset about it. How could he not realize if he's reading First Things that this has gone beyond having some influence?
I have no explanation. I
He
honestly
probably just
don't.
doesn't read the articles he doesn't write there. Maybe I'm guessing, but
It's I mean there's there is so it sort of defies reason to take the positions that he's taking, and I can only assume that at the age of 73 he's sort of he's locked into what he's going to be.
yeah, and that's good for him because he's probably better for his soul not to deal with a bunch of this stuff. But the idea, but he's wrong about this. He's wrong about this because he's not connected enough to know.
So there are two other problems with what Weigel's doing here. I think one is more something that I'm inferring from what he's saying here, um, which is that he describes it in historical terms, which of course is something we're going to do in the book. So he sees it as historical, but because he's 73, I think he is he thinks in terms of the Second Vatican Council reforms as definitive.
Yeah,
Whereas if you're in your 20s, that is, if you're 50 years younger than Weigel, the Second Vatican Council is the priestly crisis. It's the decline in religious orders. It's the pedophilia scandals. It's the failure of social conservatives as a political coalition to stop same-sex marriage, the meaninglessness of overturning Roe versus Wade in light of some of the state reforms, the state of outsider or exclusion that many conservatives experience in public life. I mean, we just had Gretchen Whitmer profaning the
what the heck was that, man? That's
communion
so
by
weird.
giving a Dorito to a woman who was taking it as though it were communion, and she was doing it in a sexual way. So like when you're like mocked, and Weigel's response is Vatican II. What people are going to say is, yeah, repeal it, right? Because
Yeah.
they think it's that simple because they're in their 20s.
Well,
And Weigel's response is get offline or get off the
yeah.
internet. Like
And part of
that
the
what could be more
issue,
boomer?
and like we've pointed out like numerous times, the issue is that it's understandable that after the council, people would downplay the sort of toxicity and problems before the council because they're embarrassed about it. They're embarrassed about the fact that what's his name, Father Coughlin was starting his own paramilitary Nazi unit in like the 1930s,
Yeah, the
and that
Christian
was very
Front.
popular. The Christian Front, and that was very popular. They're embarrassed by the fact that Action Francais warped into the Vichy regime and sent 70,000 Jews to the Holocaust. They're embarrassed about the fact that uh, Francisco Franco had a bunch of people murdered, and he rallied a base around based on conspiracy theories about Masons and Jews, and he was pretty much a secret ally with the Nazis until like 1940, was it 1943? They're
Yeah,
embarrassed by the
there's Father Tizo in Slovakia. You have a straight up Catholic priest running a Nazi collaborator regime.
oh, and same thing in Croatia too, with the Franciscans in Croatia cooperating with the
Yeah,
Holocaust there, right?
with Ante Pavlich. Yeah,
Yeah.
so there's
So we
just
are
like
pointing out all these things because we're realizing, like, yeah, it might hurt us in the short term for evangelization if we're honest about this stuff. But in the long term, it's better because we're finding out what happens when we don't talk about this stuff. It's like now people think, oh, look, there was no need for the Second Vatican Council, which is absolute BS. We absolutely needed it, and it, yeah, right. But the young people don't know that, and George Weigel doesn't realize it. He doesn't realize that most of the people, a lot of the people, I don't know the numbers exactly, but my suspicion is maybe even a majority, if not a majority, it's a healthy minority in the seminaries today are post liberal.
yeah, and to the point where they're like Cardinal Ottaviani was right. We should have kept like Murray is dumb and bad and heretical, and he should have been kept under the censor, under the ban. And we would not have any of these problems had we followed the sort of Franco vision for the regime of a right wing Catholic totalitarian state. Never mind the fact that everyone in Franco's regime was starving,
Yeah,
because at least when they were starving, they were godly people. And let alone that, like, a lot of people in Franco's regime were like part of a I maybe I'm getting this confused with Portugal, but both Portugal and Franco had their fair share of, let's just say, moral problems of the sexual variety in them. I think it was Salazar in Portugal who had the guy who ran his propaganda arm was the head of basically like the biggest orgies in the city.
yeah,
And it's, and you keep running into this problem in Hungary where like the most based people that are like in a Hungary and part of this sort of like Fidesz and Catholic stuff, they all turn out to be incredibly creepy. Like the
yeah,
priest that was at the NatCon in Budapest turned out to be like into kids, right? Isn't that?
yeah,
And
yeah.
there
And a
was
lot
a
of it's because the kind of people that can make the moral excuses to put themselves in power in these within these subcultures are the people with the moral flexibility because they're not very and they don't have a lot of integrity
they
themselves.
have
So
a
that
lot of practice,
yeah, yeah, they have a
and
lot of practice.
engaging in immoral and
Yeah.
compromising positions. They could rationalize a lot of sin.
And if you go back in through the history of the church, I mean, if you read it from a social historical perspective that actually looks on the ground, isn't looking at the writings of saints who are saints, right?
Right.
But looking how things are at the ground, there was a huge problem between Constantine and the Reformation. And I'm not, I'm a Catholic. Between of corruption because you have this worldly power that the church has, and it's going to every Bill Clinton out there is going to be looking for power. They want to become a cardinal. They want to become
Yeah.
right. So you have that issue of power. We probably have had the least corrupt clergy we've ever had since the church has lost power.
And of course, none of this is known to these to a lot of these kids because they've grown up with a lot of like anti-Catholic bias in the news that they
Yeah,
accept as gospel, where there's a lot of coverage of real sins committed by people in the church, but without the context of the fact that a lot of institutions are dealing with this problem,
yeah,
right? The rabbis, Protestants, um, Islamic leaders.
Yeah.
There's also just like secular charitable leaders, like let's
Yeah.
I mean Diddy. I mean, come on. Like it's just like it's nonstop with this stuff. And you could say that the standards are higher for Catholic clergy, and of course that is
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
But it is also that there's nothing uniquely sinful about a post Vatican II church. Human nature remains fallen in the need of grace to be saved.
Yeah, exactly. There were some reforms that needed to be done because the bishops were they had this forgiving mentality that we could put people back in position after they've healed and whatever. But maybe it was just extremely imprudent because
And partly it was the bishops being kind of suckers for a lot of early psychological approaches
that's right.
to these
Psychologists would
issues.
assure them that they've solved this issue and all this other stuff. So
The same psychologists that wanted to like close down all of the sanitariums, and so major cities had these areas flooded with people that had paranoid schizophrenia.
yeah, yeah. But
There's a
the thing
McDonald's in
is,
Houston that never recovered because that's where they were dropped off.
oh, really?
Yeah, and there was like this huge encampment of mental patients that
Interesting.
never got past that McDonald's. They just all lived in the area under bridges.
Oh, interesting. So what we're trying to say is like we're trying to actually defend the church in the sense of like if you have an organization that lasts for 2,000 years, you're going to have some you know, bad apples in it. It's just there's another way to avoid that, and you're going to have it's going to work. But just go to your local parish. Most people's local parish have a good priest. They have got a good thing going on there or whatever. We shouldn't judge the whole thing based on all the things that are newsworthy, the things that happen newsworthy because they're going to happen in any large organization.
But in the
Um,
absence of people making these kinds of arguments with the level of heft and prestige that people of the Weigel generation at least used to have, you end up with that vacuum being filled with what we're going to do is we're going to bring back Louis the Ninth, and this time we're going
yeah,
to burn all the Talmuds.
yeah,
And yeah,
yeah. And those guys always leave out that even the Pope at the time critiqued Louis for doing that. I think a guy Matthew Scarens, is that
yeah,
how
yeah,
he pointed out like the Pope even in Louis' lifetime critiqued him for doing that,
yeah. And
and the
what's
trads will always say like, oh, we should do that. That was a good thing.
and I've got Andrew's book over here, Andrew Willard Jones's book, and if you go to page 400, you'll find that he never mentions it in the entire book, and
Oh,
that's
interesting.
it's one of the problems that you'll run into a lot of this ressourcement is that it's ressourcement with a very specific political agenda with a
Yeah,
lot of omissions, and so you see this in a lot of this work too. There's like somebody brought back some book by Julio Mineville, who was a critic of Maritain's.
yeah.
And I think Waldstein endorsed it, and I think I went through it. It's been a long time. I don't think anyone ever mentions that he wrote one of the craziest anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in Spanish. It's
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
like it's these are the things that are left out
Oh,
from this
yeah.
sort of stuff to
Yeah, because
avoid getting them in trouble.
it's like all a bunch of text but out of context. And the uh what well it's not just a George Weigel issue though. It's that whole it's a generational issue. Is that yeah, Catholic conservatives over the age of 50, they've kind of been on the defensive. They have this mentality of they're there to help the other conservatives or whatever. And they do kind of adopt, whether they know it or not, a sort of no enemies to my right mentality. And
That was the where I got off track. That was exactly what I was going to say. The problem is that they tend to think that they can make friends with these people,
yeah,
and they can't. That
yeah,
if you read, and they're very plain about this. If you read what post liberals and integralists have to say about people like Novak and Newhouse and Weigel, they don't respect them.
yeah. And what I've seen is I'm not gonna name names here, but I've seen sort of people like us, but they're like older. They're in their 60s or 70s, and the boomers control the institution still, right? So they have their institutions that are well funded, and they can provide platforms for people, and they will offer as a sort of like olive branch some of these platforms to some of these people who are like these post liberals, thinking like, hey, we're big tent here, you guys can be included. But there's no reciprocity. When the post liberals have the institutional power and they're offering the platforms, they're not hiring people like us, right? because people like us are positively excluded. We don't get invited back to the meetings, that things that you where we used to be invited, we're not no longer invited, or jobs where we used to be hired, we're no longer hired, right? And So that's sort of so. I mean, from somebody who's 39 and you're in your early 40s, we're both old millennials. Uh, that's annoying to us. It's annoying to us that these older people that basically agree with us are sort of enabling this, and they're not doing anything to critique it because they're afraid of critiquing anybody on their side.
Yeah, especially the it's when it's noticeable that the reason they're doing this is because some of these post liberals have secured positions of influence that we don't have,
Yeah,
and they want to reward them for securing that influence, often because it's not something they earned, it's something that they inherited, or it's because they're willing to betray their country. So I am especially agitated by the fact that while I've been the person who's been trying to continue the project that these people initiated,
yeah,
that the response I get is, well, we're going to have to accommodate them. And this gets us to the fourth reason why I think Weigel's doing this, which is Pope Francis. Weigel does not seem to like the trajectory of the Francis papacy, and neither
hmm
do the post liberals. But the post
although
liberals,
some of them play politics with Pope
yeah, they do
Francis.
it very strategically. Of course,
Yeah,
Adrian loves the Francis approach to China, which is to hand the church over to China, in not a very integralist way. Like on paper, integralism is the church providing spiritual instruction to the regime, and if the regime fails to follow it, for the church to call for preemption of that regime, because the spiritual power is greater than the temporal. When the Chinese arrangement is just pure Sino-Gallicanism, and for whatever reason he's fine with that because he loves China, and he thinks that if Xi gets baptized, then we have kingdom of God on earth.
yeah, yeah. So I think you and I have been you know you and I are pretty middle of the road where with Pope Francis and stuff. We don't get into this sort of politics of it. We're just he obviously has his strengths and weaknesses. He's not a theologian like Benedict or John Paul II, but he's also there, washing prisoners' feet and stuff, and that's really cool. He visited my daughter in the hospital when I was in Rome. Like that was really cool. It was so we just try to stay out of that. But yeah, Weigel's and a lot of people like him, uh, they're more worried about Pope Francis than they are the post liberals.
And so they'll make common cause with them in their criticisms of this papacy, thinking that they'll be friends when, as you said before, it's a one-way transaction. And I
Yeah,
think in some cases with this sort of boomer generation of Catholics that are like Weigel and experience a lot of proximity to the Pope and the Vatican under John Paul II and Benedict XVI. They don't have that under Francis.
yeah, that's right.
And so it's personal and professional too. It's that we were the proper liaisons for American serious Orthodox American Catholicism, and
Yeah,
Francis doesn't take that seriously anymore. If you go back and watch during the Benedict's 16th papacy, there was this amazing event that Robbie George put on in the
yeah,
Vatican. It had a wider range, wide assortment of incredible thinkers. Some of it was done in English, some of it in Italian, whatever these people spoke was all translated. It was days and days long. And it was like, I watched every minute of it. Um, and you don't see Robbie there anymore. Weigel's not, it doesn't have the same access with the Francis papacy. And so, some of this really does feel like, that they need to find what friends they can in order to get leverage to get back in there if Francis leaves leaves the earth before they do, so that they can return with and start to work influence in the Vatican the way they used to. But the thing is the post liberals don't want their influence in there. The post liberals
yeah,
are using them.
yeah, yeah. And I noticed that the same what you just said makes me think also the same thing applies with JD Vance. Um, because there's pressure. Even we get like nudges and pressure that not critique JD Vance too much. And what it is even like normie Catholics or fusionist Catholics or whatever Catholics or like just not post-liberal Catholics, um, they all have friends that know JD Vance. So
Yeah.
like if JD Vance gets elected, like wow, we've got a vice president who we're 2 degrees removed from. That that proximity to influence and power, I think kind of it sort of it becomes a temptation, I think, for people then and that it might also just be socially awkward. You're at an event with JD Vance and you've been critiquing him.
There's two
So
ways to approach these issues. There's how much am I willing to compromise in order to be closer to these people?
uh,
And that's the bad one. And the good one is how much are they willing to compromise in order to come closer to me? Because
yeah.
I'm on the right side here. And that's the good one. Uh, because I want Vance to compromise on the idea of autocratic state power, because
Yeah,
that's BS. All right. So, a lot of the pressure you get here is to be a good soldier, to be loyal,
yeah,
right? But that is not how a republic functions. If you're
yeah,
going to have someone represent you, they need to be loyal to you.
yeah,
Now, some of the things you may want may be dumb and bad, and therefore you should be fortunate to have representatives who can exercise judgment.
yeah,
But if they're demanding loyalty from you, they're not representative, and they do not have a Republican little r view of the country. They see themselves as due the power they possess and wield it over you, which you have the pleasure of enduring. And I do
yeah,
not. I just bristle at the very idea that people would ever find that attractive, but unfortunately,
yeah.
many people do. They want proximity.
Yeah, no, JD Vance is never going to listen to you people. I'm sorry. If he gets
Oh
power,
yeah, he doesn't care about us. I mean, I
yeah, he's
wouldn't.
he's more interested in what JD or what Peter Thiel wants or
Yeah,
possibly
and that's
possibly
part of the
what
public
Patrick Deneen
humiliation.
wants. But
Yeah, that's part of the public humiliation that Trump puts him through. Right, Trump wants he'll impose loyalty tests. I should mention that like I'm the last person on earth that doesn't have a strong opinion about Donald Trump.
yeah,
So like I'm just saying that it's obvious that Trump does this, and he's been doing this his entire life, where
yeah,
he expects loyalty from people in a way that makes sense maybe in the way that he ran a company, but to me is antithetical to how Republican governments function.
yeah,
But and Pence didn't give him enough. Pence
yeah,
was in a better negotiating position because he could kind of bring the foot soldiers most likely to vote for Vance. I mean, not Vance, but Trump back in 2016 or so. The bargain went, and Vance doesn't bring anything to this except that he's more loyal and will say anything, do anything, compromise on anything to get that position.
yeah.
Doug Burgum apparently was the person they were going to originally bring on board, and I don't know very much about Doug Burgum.
Looks like George Washington.
Yeah, he's got a great head of hair and he's worth a lot of money. And so it makes sense that Trump wanted him because that's how Trump thinks, right? It's like, yeah, that Pence looked like a president.
Yeah.
That's why he picked him as vice
I,
president. And so
I
is
have to
Burgum.
I have to tell you that after the assassination, I was in these sort of group chats with these people that were like sort of center right people who uh like Nikki Haley voters, and they had like opening up to the possibility of actually voting for Trump because they didn't like Trump, right? Because the sort of sympathy of him getting shot is this hope that there's going to be a change. And as soon as he picked Vance, they were like, "Oh no, everything's the same."
Yeah.
Yeah. So it hurt him with those type of people to pick Vance instead of somebody like Burgum, I think.
And it's just because Vance is this is so there were these leaked DMs that came out a couple weeks ago. The Washington Post ran the fact that even as late as 2020, Vance was really disrespectful about Donald Trump.
Oh,
Like,
interesting.
yeah, very nasty statements about Donald Trump. So these got leaked. Of course, immediately what you get is criticism of the leaker,
Yeah.
um, and for being a bad person, but not for Vance, who said these things. When this should be humiliating for Vance, that he's
Yeah.
willing to eat boot leather ice cream for breakfast every day.
Yeah.
And then what sort of forgave a lot of that was the fact that he went on to the vice presidential debate and absolutely humiliated Walls.
Yeah.
So people are like, oh, so he can be his own man on stage. And then at the very end of that debate, what does he have to do? He has to deal with the J6 question.
Oh yeah.
And it was like, oh, here it is.
Yeah.
He's getting out the cone, and he's getting it, and he's got the boot leather ice cream, and it's just, and he's just shoving it in his mouth. He's just like, tastes good.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's I would rather there be someone on the ticket that can exercise a certain degree of independence and comfortable disagreement with whoever's on the top of the ticket. This
Yeah.
was certainly the case in previous presidential administrations. I don't see why Trump has to be anything special just because he got shot in the ear.
Yeah.
But it's I mean, I don't know. We've had bad candidates before, but what matters in the broader context of the Weigel question is that if Vance wins and becomes the sort of de facto heir apparent, um, then he's going to have to go to the post liberals
Yeah.
rather than the other way around, and they will not. They will not be interested because they're going to be fighting with those other people that you were talking about, and we talked about with I'm sorry, I'm getting my podcast mixed up, but I was on the Law and Liberty podcast that I host. Stephanie Slade brought up that there's actually a lot of competition in the post-liberal space among integralists, but also sort of Nietzschean secular types that are about or called vitalists. So it used to be called vitalists, and then
That's
your
right.
NatCon. So there's a lot of competition. They're not going to be interested in anything Weigel brings because Weigel's going to bring dead weight. Nobody wants
Yeah.
him.
Yeah.
If
He's the
what
first one to
Vance
get
did.
shot after the revolution.
That's right. Yeah, he is 100% a kulak, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah. No, I think that's right. And yeah, so I just don't want to participate in it. It's gonna be really awkward for me. Maybe make it awkward for some of the people that I know who have organizations that are trying to gain influence from Vance, um, or and to me, it's like probably what it was like for Yves Simone and Jacques Maritains. Their friends become fascists, or at least sympathetic to it, or not wanting to say anything against it, or um, it's just a really unfortunate thing. I mean, and people have it all backwards too, by the way, historically speaking. There's a sort of myth that most big like religious and political movements were grassroots. No, it actually, most of them aren't. Most of them come from like a subsection of the elite and then it goes from there, right? Even Christianity, I've been reading Rodney Stark, and he makes basically, I mean, he brings up, he shows the sources. I mean, it was mostly from the top down, like, in the sense of like it grew among elite circles in cities, and even into the Middle Ages, the evangelization to the rural peasantry was pretty weak. So
Well, they
um
have it makes sense. Peasants do not have much in the way of wealth.
mhm.
If they are going to sacrifice future opportunities, it needs to be worth it, not
Yeah,
just for them, but also for their kin networks. And so it's very unlikely you're going to procure from the peasantry a lot of religious,
yeah,
unless they're fleeing. And they're also not in regular contact with learning and are illiterate.
yeah,
And so it's hard to break them of pagan folk ways. So you have to increasingly accommodate them.
yeah,
Whereas wealthy people, they have experience with wealth that makes them understand the limits of its use.
yeah.
But they also have opportunities for leisure that give them the ability to learn and
Hmm.
pray and meditate and fund institutions that are dedicated to those projects.
Yeah.
So it just makes sense. And so and we're seeing it repeated in patterns today
And
with more educated and wealthy people being religious than less.
yeah, and we don't think that integral. No, first of all, my biggest concern with integralism is that it's going to like hurt the church. It's going to like corrupt the church,
That's
and it's
all
going
it's
to,
ever done.
yeah, it's going to corrupt the church. But the secondary consideration is what we've seen repeatedly. It's you're not going to get like a modern integralist state. It's the whole sociology and politics and everything is going to prevent anything like their ideal integralist state, which I don't think they should want anyways, but it's not going to happen. What's going to happen is they're going to go into coalition with all these anti-democratic and anti-liberal and and these autocratic forces, and then that's going to help them. It's going to help these anti-democratic, anti-liberal, whatever forces. But it's not
That's what
going to.
happened in Portugal. It's what
Yeah,
happened in Spain. It's what
yes, what
happened in
happened.
Argentina. It's what happened in
Yes,
Brazil. It's what
that's
happened in
right.
Austria. It's just
That's right. Or
every damn time.
even in Germany, like the sort of monarchists and integralists, like Carl Schmitt and what's his name, von Papen. Those ones, they were like cooperating with the sort of like they're more like vitalists, right? They were like these sort of neo-pagan
Yeah.
conservatives that they were all what united them was they opposed they opposed the parliament, they opposed representative democracy, they wanted a stronger state, they wanted whatever. So what they did was they formed a coalition of destruction which destroyed Weimar, and then what filled in after they destroyed the checks on power that were the federalism that they had. The German state was never like great, as it wasn't like the United States, but they had some checks on authoritarian power in place in terms of federalism in the parliament, and they sort of cooperated to destroying public sentiment against those things. And also they had the coup in Prussia, and they had they had the Enabling Act. It was the coup, the final blow. Uh, and then what happened? Did you get your monarchy, your integralism, or whatever? No, you just gave a bunch of power to the thugs that it took over, the Nazis, and then they hated the Nazis. I'll give them that. They hated the Nazis, but they cooperated with destroying the institutions that would have prevented the Nazis from taking the absolute power that they did.
And you don't see any saints coming out of the Tiso regime or under the Ustachi in Croatia. Instead, you see saints like Edith Stein.
Yeah.
And who is the Marian, the Polish priest who died?
Max Kolbe.
Yeah. Like the people who became saints were the ones who died in death camps.
Yeah.
All right. So one of the biggest losses of Catholic life you experience in the midst of all of this is the fact that the Russians, that the Soviets made common cause with the fascists.
Yeah.
In order to annihilate the lives of Polish Catholics.
Yeah.
So I don't know, man. Sounds bad.
No, it sounds bad. It is something that, and actually, the more I've studied it, the more I've been concerned. Like at first, I was just concerned about the effect on the church, and now I'm actually concerned that it actually could have some political influence, and not a good one.
And again, I have Weigel's book here, the irony of modern Catholic history. One of the ironies is that of the people who know best what the problems were of this period are the ones doing the least to deal with it, because they cannot take it seriously, even though their own scholarship tells you to take it seriously. It's because they see it as primarily historical and dealt with, and unfortunately that's not how these things work. They need to be dealt with, and they need to be dealt with early, because it's too late to deal with them when they've gotten a certain amount of momentum. And I'm afraid that it's already past when it can be dealt with by people like Weigel or other people of his generation, and that now we're going to be stuck with this sort of thing. And these people, like I was saying before, adopt this view of the spiritual authority being superior to that of the temporal, but in practice the regimes they support subjugate the spiritual regime to state propaganda and ideology, and they're more than willing to serve as courtly enablers to whoever is available to provide them just one little drop of power. Right, Lazarus, extending one little finger of water down to the rich man in hell.
Yeah.
That's what they are towards power and influence of recognition from people in control.
And as we talked about with the integralism episode and the episode with Kevin Valier, there hasn't really been a integralist regime since the High Middle Ages because the the kind of social the spread out social organization and the strength of the modern state does not like allow for it. Uh,
Yeah, the church doesn't command tremendous tracts of land and a huge amount of
yeah,
capital and a rival territory for peasants to work on that doesn't require them to be
yeah,
dragooned into fighting every 10 years or every 10
yeah.
months.
And that's
um,
not going to change. I mean, the church is never going to have that relative power to everyone else ever again. It's just it happened after for some time between the Carolingian period and the was already on its way out in the beginning of the 14th century, right?
yeah, this is the sublime historical experience. I actually brought this up in the first article I ever wrote on integralism, and I remember Sora Bamari. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was the second one. It was after Republican. It's one of these ones that I read. It's either um, why integralism is an ideology of despair. Now that I think about it, I think it's after Republican Virtue, um, in which I talk about the sublime historical experience where a guy, and a very unusual historian named Frank Ankerschmidt wrote this book. It's very long. And one of the things he talks about is what drives people to write history and to write history the way that they do is that they fall in love with the particular moment that they imagine, not something that really happened, but that they imagine, and then they try to aesthetically represent it in their own literature. And what makes the sublime historical experience sublime is that it's this imagined past in which all things that you like were realized, but it's also very tragic because it was lost. And you, as a result, become, as the historian, the actor in history who will resume it into the present or the near future better than ever, which is exactly the political program that Adrian offers and all of his work on integrating from within. But is the reason why it captures the imagination of so many young people today, because it's a story in which they become the messiahs for their own kingdom of God on earth.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't sound Christian to me, but that's the story.
Yeah. So I mean, from the bigger frustration for me than for uh, George Weigel, I guess, is that same mentality. You find it among like the bishops too, because they're that same generation. Um, or else because I haven't seen any evidence of any of the bishops trying to like respond to this. And it's all over the theology departments and the seminaries and all of this. Young people, young formative mind. I mean, minds that are blank slates and can be formed at this point are being formed by YouTube post liberals or by post liberal bloggers. You know, occasionally a post liberal book. But those are the ones that are really forming their mind about this stuff. And the I'm sorry, the boomer people in charge of these institutions have completely dropped the ball on it.
The only limiting factor on the success of this in the future will be the willingness of congregations to listen
Yeah,
to this nonsense, as an increasing percentage of young and active priesthood starts to adopt these positions. I can imagine that in many parishes, there's going to be less of an appetite for this than they might hope,
yeah,
and that is all we got, right? Like it's
yeah,
just a sort of cultural inertia is too great.
yeah.
But
And
with the changing nature of the church, that may not actually be something to count on either. This is, we
it,
cannot take the present or the recent past for granted.
no,
These things are all dynamic.
no, and like a lot of times the complaint in the U.S. has been that the bishops are too liberal, but it could easily turn around really quickly, and next thing you know, you're like France at the turn of the century, where the bishops are, there's pretty integralist and clericalist bishops, right?
Last time we had bishops that were that divided was not that long ago.
Yeah,
It was well, I guess to some people might seem that long ago, but it was about 100 years ago. And there was just like open season between people like Cardinal Gibbons and Archbishop Corrigan
Yeah.
over Americanism. Like Archbishop Corrigan of New York was rooting for the anti-Americanists in the Vatican to condemn Ireland, Archbishop John Ireland and Cardinal Gibbons. And Corrigan did this because he was a reactionary, but I think also I have the book over here. I don't remember if this is the case, but there's a really great book called The Sons of St. Patrick, and I think Corrigan was kind of hoping that he'd get red hatted, and if he could find a way to get Gibbons out of the mix, then he can get red hatted. But as a result of this blow up between the two of them, the two people that were most likely to get red hatted next, Ireland and Corrigan, who are facing off against each other, neither of them got it.
Mm.
So this kind of like open conflict between American bishops and cardinals is not something we've seen before, but could very easily happen
Yeah.
if there is this much division over things like the social question.
Yeah. And then we saw it with, I mean, you and I have been big fans of Bishop Barron for, I mean, I've been a big fan of Bishop Barron since I used to watch his movie reviews on YouTube when I was in like 2008 or something like that, when I was a seminarian. Um, and I still think that Bishop Barron's a normie who has normie political views. But I also think politics isn't something he spends a lot of time on. So I think I don't think he realizes how radical some of this post-liberalism stuff is. Um, and
Yeah, I think if you handed him Phimister and Crean's book on integralism, he'd probably not be a fan.
yeah, well, and he's a defender of the Second Vatican Council too. So I don't, it's I think there's some confusion there too, because in theological circles, sometimes they use the word post-liberal, and it's just it's moving beyond like liberal theological liberalism. Um,
Which
but
is terrible.
Yeah, we're opposed to that too.
Yeah.
But that's not what they're talking about with post-liberal politics.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Post human dignity, post rights of individuals.
yeah,
Uh, uh,
post citizenship for
for
obviously.
Jews.
Oh
Yeah.
no, and now these are like the hardliners. Obviously,
Yeah.
Deneen is one time he tweeted he was an ecumenical integralist.
Yeah.
Um, that
I am a round quadrangle. Yeah, this is the kind.
yeah,
These are the kinds of things you do to yourself when you're trying
yeah,
not to let the people who are on your extreme
yeah,
take over the term. Right. This is always the
yeah,
problem with radical movements: is there's always someone more radical coming down.
yeah.
So they had to come down on Phimister and Crean's book like a ton of bricks, and it was only because Phimister and Crean are so weird
Uh-huh.
that they couldn't outflank Vermeulen. You know.
Yeah, well, the issue with Deneen isn't religious liberty. It's that he wants to destroy all the institutions that really protect it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, religious liberty is great. We just shouldn't have any institutions protecting it. And
yeah. We should have like more autocratic, like triangle based, like
Aristopopulism.
Aristopopulism, and
Yeah.
then I'm sure that religious minorities would do just fine.
Yeah. If you wear a scarf and glasses with blue frames, you know you're an Aristopopulist.
Oh boy.
A scarf indoors, a kiki scarf. All right, I'm being mean. No, of course, today doesn't adopt the more radical position here. He doesn't seem to just appreciate the consequences of his own arguments.
Yeah.
And but I don't want this to turn into a generic rant
Oh yeah.
about
I'm
these
sorry.
guys.
Yeah, yeah. But
Uh,
but yeah,
uh,
we should be concerned about this. It's not just. I mean, if it is an online phenomenon, it's a very serious one that's going to spill over into the real world.
yeah, and the attraction here is not something that makes sense to Weigel the same way me today. The attraction that students have to, I don't know, weird fashions from the 90s makes no sense to me. Like I'm embarrassed by them. So the fact that young Catholics would be attracted to weird fascist ideas from the 1930s makes no sense to Weigel. So he wants to diminish its importance because it plays no role in his life. But
Yeah.
unfortunately, that's not what we're dealing with. We're dealing with something more substantial, overrepresented among the people most likely to enter into the priesthood or positions of leadership. So
Yeah.
The idea that just because it's online makes it irrelevant seems to be wildly out of date
Yeah.
in terms of how online functions in public discourse. So
Yeah.
we kindly suggest that Weigel reconsider these views, considering we have, at least on this narrow issue, more expertise than he does,
Yeah.
as a result of his own refusal to secure that expertise for himself.
Yeah. So James, did you think if you wanted to get a job in a Catholic academia in a theology or philosophy department today, would it help you or hurt you to be a post-liberal?
It would not disqualify you from any positions where they're already not hiring a conservative.
Uh-huh.
And it would probably help you in places where there are conservatives, given that post liberalism has become a kind of counter ideology to the prevailing theological liberalism in a lot of larger, quote, more prestigious American Catholic theology departments today.
Yeah.
So there's no downside.
Yeah, but there is downside vocally opposing it.
Yeah, so you stay conservative, so you're disqualified from all the positions where they're only going to hire libs. But because you're opposed to post liberalism, that means that you're not in support of the counter ideology either, which means that you're actually in a lot of trouble. You don't fit into either category.
Yeah.
So you have to find places that are not keeping up with this. What this normally places that are not keeping up with these kinds of debates, however, typically are lower prestige because they're just looking for someone to get there because maybe they are like in like rural Ohio and no one wants to
Yeah.
move there. So you'll get a job teaching in a theology department for 4 years until the college closes.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's yeah, it's not
Sorry to make
it's a
it bleak
bigger.
for you, Thomas.
Oh no, it's all good. It's fine. Yeah, I pay my own way, I find my own way. Or at least
Just like a lib,
with the
you're
help
going to
of
go your own way,
go my own way, but with the
like
help
with Stevie Nicks.
yeah, yeah, with the
Speaking
help
of
of
boomers,
that's true. I wonder but yeah, with the help of Providence, of course. Providence has been very good, you know.
yeah. All right, this has been a return to form of angry,
Yeah, so I'm
simmering
sorry if we came across as ranting and angry today. But
George. Listen to us. It's worse than you think.
and Jonah Goldberg, you should have us on your show, please.
Yes. Look at us.
Jonah.
We're all set up.
Yes, look,
I
Jonah,
got this
listen to us.
microphone. Look at this microphone.
Yeah, Acton Institute got me a microphone because they thought I sounded terrible
They were
without one,
right.
and they were right. Yeah.
All right, guys. If I've been a little nastier today, it's only because I am in the midst of a post hurricane cleanup and grading spree. So I apologize if we were a little negative, but we were just having fun. We wanted to respond to this, and hopefully we've done that. Anything else, Thomas?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we saw just thanks for listening, everybody. We've gotten some really good feedback from people. Apparently, people actually like listening to us, James. So that's kind of a nice thing to find out.
Dulcet
And
tones.
but make sure you like and subscribe, and what else?
Hit the
Follow us
bell
on
icon
Twitter.
so that you always know when we're posting. We post weekly, usually either on Monday or Tuesday, unless there is a hurricane. Normally, I'll be the one affected by that. Follow us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever fine podcasts are listed, as long as they're Spotify or Apple, because those are the only two we are on.
Yes. Have a great week, everyone.
Bye.